We're going to skip a little bit of the Agadita. You can learn it on your own if you like. I'm following my Rebbe's footsteps. She used to skip Agadita. And let's take a look at Chavroseha Man. Actually, a little bit beyond that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'kulam lifsol. So we're on Daf Yud Zayin, and it's 4 lines down from the top. And Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying, v'kulam lifsol. We had a whole list of different locations, and there was always a chash mamzeres because of the Aseres HaShvatim that got mixed in together with the Goyim, with the idol worshippers. And they married women that were Jewish, and they had children, and those children, according to one opinion, are mamzerim. Because if a Jewish woman has a relationship with a non-Jewish man, the child is a mamzer, again, according to that opinion. We don't pass it like that, but that is an opinion. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says, "V'kulam lifsol." This is a deviation, if you will, from what we learned until now. Because the premise that we were operating with until this point was that if a guy has a relationship with a Jewish woman, the child is a mamzer. And now we're saying, no, that although that might be true, let's take the opposite case. Let's say if a Jewish man would marry a non-Jewish woman, then the child would be kosher. Now, before we assume that Yisrael Abal Nochris Avlad Mamzer, and the reason why there's mamzerus, even in this time period, is because these children that came from these mixed marriages, we were not careful about identifying them and setting up Isurei Arayos and so forth and so on. So there was a whole mixture in which, because of the intermarriage, even relatives, could marry relatives, and it would be a violation of erva. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, kulam lifsol. All the children in these places, even in a case where let's say a Jewish man would marry a non-Jewish woman, where the child is certainly a guy, but nevertheless, we're still worried about mamzerus when they converted, because there was such an mixture of Jewish blood, is kulam lifsol. Now the Gemara goes back to a statement of Rabbi Yehuda on the previous Amud. He had quoted Rav Asi that an akum that has a relationship with a Jewish girl is, we don't know for sure whether the guy is a guy or he might be Jewish, because he might be the offspring of a mixed marriage and his mother was Jewish. And therefore, such an idol worshiper we have to be choshesh for his kedusha, that maybe his marriage is valid. Now Rabbi Yehuda continues, and after the death of Rav Asi, he comes in front of Shmuel. When I said to Shmuel, bless you, when I related to Shmuel the words of Rav Asi, that if a guy is Makadosh Bas Yisrael in our time, we have to worry about Kedushin. Amalei Shmuel responded, the Torah says, Lo tischatein bam, bitcha lo sitein livno, ubita lo sikach livnecha, levanecha, ki yosir es bimcha me'acharai, v'yavdu Elohim achirim. And what does this teach us? That bimcha, that means the daughter, let's say, of the son of your daughter, which being your grandson through your daughter, Haba Bnei Yisraelis, who is born to your daughter who is Jewish, Ori Bincha, in that case, she's considered the child of that mother is Jewish. And the Torah is saying, Lo tischatin bon ki yoser es bincha me'acharecha, that since the father is a guy, therefore the father will have such an impact on the son that it'll bring him away from Hashem. The ain bincha ba min alveres kochavim kori bincha el binah. But if, let's say, your daughter, in this case, your daughter-in-law, I guess you'd call it, right? And your grandson, let's call it your biological grandson, the son of your daughter-in-law, who is a non-Jewish woman, that is not considered binch, that's binah. So he writes here, Sharei lo nemar al bas hanochri shetinase libanecha. If your son marries out, right, to a non-Jewish woman, it doesn't say shehi tasir as bincha, which is ben bincha, right, the son of your son. In the same way it says in the case of Bitcha, your daughter married a guy, which is your son-in-law, that he will be Meisir es Bincha. And the Masechet offers a whole explanation for this. He says, Hainu mishum she'afim teled lo ben if this non-Jewish daughter-in-law of yours has a son, v'tasireda me'achorei Hashem, ein ben bincha zeh kori bincha. The son of your son is not considered your son. Why? Because his yichus goes from his mother, who's a non-Jewish mother. Even though he's your biological grandson through your son. And the bottom line is that the status of the child, his yuchsin, is determined by the mother, not by the father. You're talking about a guy who is Makadesh, a Jewish woman. Even if I want to assume that his father was one of the Aser Sashvatim, nevertheless, he married a non-Jewish woman, and that child is not Jewish. So therefore, when he's Makadesh, a Jewish woman, that Kedushin is not valid. So I don't know, Shmuel's giving us only half of the picture over here. He's saying that what we should be worried about is that this guy is a product of a mixed marriage in which his mother was a Goyeta and his father was Jewish. It could be the other way around. Why aren't we afraid that maybe the mother was Jewish and the father was non-Jewish? Because when we say that the Aser Hashvatim were mixed in, it's not just the male members of the Aser Hashvatim, it's the female members as well. So the Gemara immediately objects to the fact that Shmuel is not worried about the Kiddushin. It's certainly a non-Jew, and the Kiddushin is not valid. What about the Jewish girls from the Aser Hashvatim that mixed in with the Goyim, and they married idolaters, in which case the child is Jewish? Amar Ravina, and Ravina now is medayik from the fact that the Torah says, Bitcha lo sitein libno, ki yosir es bincha me'acharan. Shma mina, ben bitcha ba min ha'ovek l'chavim kari bincha. So this again is going to support the Gemara's objection to the Kasha on Shmuel, because the Torah calls the case of an Oved Kochavim that has a relation with a Jewish girl, that's Bitcha. this is your grandson, meaning he's Jewish. Therefore, we should be choshesh for kiddush. And again, it could very well be that since his daughter, who's a Jewish girl, had a relationship with a guy, was married to a guy, and the child is Jewish, that child would be a mamzer because of the halacha of Bas Yisrael, of Akuma Bal Bas Yisrael, so mamzer. And the Gemara says, "Gemiri de pinta de nasa da hu dara itztruye itztru." So Gemiri means we have an oral tradition that the daughters of Aseres Hashvatim that went into Assyria, they went into Ashur, is Nivka Brachman Milaklot Zera V'Nasas HaKoros. That they could not bear children, they became barren. And that was part of the punishment, the experience of exile to Ashur. So therefore, we're not going to be afraid that any of the tzatza'im of this area are Jewish because they couldn't have Jewish mothers because the Jewish women that came in the Aseres HaShvatim to the Golus of Ashur were barren. Ika Diamri. Now the Gemara has a different version of Shmuel. Risa, when the statement of Rav Asi that was Choshesh for Kedushei Akum, in our time, Kami the Shmuel was said in front of Shmuel, Amar Li, Shmuel responded, he says, Lo Zozu Misham, the Bezdin of that door did not move from the spot, Aja Sa'um, Ovdei Kocham Gmurim. They gave the Aseres HaShvatim and the children of the Aseres HaShvatim, the offspring, the status of Ovdei Kocham Gmurim, and therefore they're mafkir the Kedusha. Shenemar, Hoskin Oshea Navi, Bashem Bagadu, Kibodim Zorim Yolod. So even when we have a generation that was born to the Aseres HaShvatim, their Kiddushin are identified and classified as Kiddushay Ovdei Kochav, and therefore we don't have to be Choshesh. And here the question is obvious. What authority do the Chachamim, does the Bezdin have in any generation, whatever generation it is, to take a Jew and make him into an Ovdei Kochav? How does that work? So if you take a look at the note here, number Yud, he says, "Midin afki inu rabbanan l'kiddushin." In other words, you can't make a Jew into a guy, but you could say that we don't recognize that Jew's marriage, and that's based on the principle called Makadish Adaita Rabbanan Makadish. So therefore, their status, children or the Aseres HaShvatim in general, the parents, as Ovdei Kochav, that's only as far as Kiddushin is concerned. Their Kiddushin are not recognized. However, Yoch LaNer says that the Lashon here of the Paskin Oshea seems to indicate that L'chol Davar Asom Ovdei Kochav. And then he writes, Nevi'im Baruch HaKodesh Nasid Dovers. I don't get it. I mean, what do you mean, Al-Pi Nevi'im? And the Navi can't change the Allah. He quotes a Marshal, and this could have tremendous repercussions. He says, since they're Noi Ka'akim, they behave like Goyim, Nasid Dinom Ka'akim. They are given the status of an Akim. This is the famous case. What was his name? Daniel, do you remember what I'm talking about? Rav Lichtenstein wrote a lot of it. Rav Lichtenstein wrote it. You have a Mumar Lavdei Kachav. At what point does he have a status of a God? So let's just underline these words. Shal Yidei Shenoi Ka'akim Nasa Dino Ka'akim. Again, this is something that that requires a lot of study. Yosef Rav Yosef Achoreder of Kahana, Yosef Rav Kahana Kameder of Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda was teaching. In the front row was Rav Kahana, and in the third row, in the next row, was Rav Yosef, behind Rav Kahana. Uka Amar, Rav Yehuda stated in his lecture, Asidim Yisrael the Ovdei Yom Tavaki Charva Tarmod. In the future, we're going to make a yontif when Tarmod will be destroyed, because the people of Tarmod were mamzerim, and they were mixed into the kahal, and they were causing a lot of psul in Yisrael, a lot of psul. So the Gemara asks for hacharif. What are you talking about? That the end of days there'll be a destruction of Tarmod. Tarmod is already completely destroyed. Hahi Tamod Havor. That's reference to a different location, which is called Tamod, not to be confused with Tarmod. Tarmod still is alive and well. Or of Ashi Omer Hainu Tarmod, Hainu Tamod, they're both the same. So whether you call the city Tamod or Tarmod, you're referring to the same identical city. But it wasn't totally destroyed. It says that although part of it was destroyed, it was able to, what's the word that I'm looking for? Regenerate itself, I guess you could say. Like, you cut a lizard in half, and half of it regenerates itself. Charev mehai gisa, it was destroyed on one side. Osiv mehai gisa. Osiv, I think, means it stood up, so to speak, meaning it was rebuilt on the other side. So that's why we can justify review the statement that Klal Yisrael will celebrate the day of the Churban, the complete Churban of Tarmod. All right, I think we could skip this next Gemara as well. Let's begin the second parak of Masechet Yevamot. The Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechta spoke about Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olam. Let's just go back to Daf Beis on the Beis for a minute, just to refresh our memories. On the top line of Beis on the Beis, you'll see the Mishnah, Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olam, which means that Ruvain and Shimon are brothers. Ruvain dies and leaves his wives for Yibum to Shimon, and then Levi is born. So these ladies who were married to Ruvain, falling for Yibum to Shimon, are considered Eishes Ach vis-a-vis Levi, because Levi was not alive. He didn't overlap with Reuven, and therefore there was no mitzvah of Yibum. And we go back to the Isur Kares of Eishes Ach. And this is all derived from the pasuk, as we're going to learn soon. Ki yeshvu achim yachdav ubeis echad mehem uben elo yavama yavo eleh yeshvu achim yachdav, dafka, that they were living in this world together at the same time, an overlap. Then yavama yavo. If they didn't have a yeshiva achas ba'olam, then there's no mitzvah yibum, and Mele Yevamot has the status of an Yisrael ach shalom b'makom mitzvah. Now he says, "Im hayu shnei achim yachdav." Let's say Reuven and Shimon were alive at the same time. Reuven married Sarah, and then Reuven died childless. Then, after Reuven's death, Levi, a third brother, was born. Is Sarah Ashes Reuven Mitziabevis with Shimon? Of course, Reuven and Shimon coexisted, so to speak. And therefore, Shimon is Miyabem, Sarah, the wife of Reuven. Now, Shimon marries Sarah, the wife of Reuven, the late Reuven, and he marries Rivka. Then he dies without any children. Now, as far as Levi and Shimon are concerned, they had a yeshiva achas. So therefore, the wives of Levi, one of whom was the wife of Reuven, fall for Yibum to Levi, because that's Yaakov. Nevertheless, there's no Yibum. Why? Because since Sarah, the wife of Reuven, became an erev of Ashes Ach, now Rivka, the other wife of Shimon, becomes a Tsaras erev. That's what he writes over here. Mishum shekvar nesra olav b'Yisrael shesach machmas Reuven. Mishum kach din ervas Ashes Ach sheba hu kidin kol harayos shliyos kapochos b'yimu yaf Rivka tzarasa pura b'yimu b'chalitza shalim. Shekeni tzaras ervas Ashes Ach shelo hoyavol. Again, just to summarize, I mean, this is old hat for us, Baruch Hashem. A little bit oriented now in Yevamos. Levi overlaps with Shimon, but not with Reuven. And therefore, Reuven's wife, who is now married B'Yibum to Shimon, because Reuven and Shimon lived at the same time, is now an Ashes Ach, Shalom B'Makom Mitzvahs Yibum, vis-a-vis Levi, because Levi did not overlap at all, not even for a minute, with Reuven. Once Sarah, the wife of Reuven, who's now the wife of Levi, of Shimon, is an Ashes Ach, then Shimon's other wife, we call her Rivka, the Tzara is a Tzara's heir. And therefore Levi has no mitzvah of Yibum whatsoever. So the Mishnah now says Ketzad. Ketzad Ashes Ochiv Shalo Haya Ba'olamo Upatis is Sarah. Shnei Achim Yachad Ba'ol. Right, there are two brothers we call Reuven and Shimon. They're alive together. Is there a word contemporaneously? Yeah, contemporaneously. Oh, the contemporaries. Umeis echad mehem. So Reuven dies without children. His wife Sarah falls to Yibum to Shimon, and then before the Yibum materializes, Nolad Lem Ach, Levi is born, and at that moment, Sarah, the wife of Reuven, is Asura Olav Mishumeshes Ach Shalohay B'Olam Ach Kach Yibem. Now Shimon went ahead and he was Miyabe Sarah Ashes Achir. Hasheni meaning Shimon, was Miyabim Sarah, who's Ashes Ach to Levi. The Achach Mes, Shimon dies without children. Sarah and Rivka fall for Yibum to Levi. is the Mishnah says that Sarah, as an erva, will patter up the Sarah, which is Rivka, for Yibum. So both Sarah and Rivka are both Pturos Miyibum v'Chalitza. Arishona, meaning Sarah, she's called the Yevamah Rishona because Shimon was miyabim Sarah, Yotza. She doesn't have any Yibum relationship, any Zika to Levi. Mishum Eshes Achiv Shelo Hayvo Lam. That's the erva of Eshes Achiv. And that there was never a matir on that erva because there was no mitzvah of Yibum because he was Shelo Hayvo Lam. Now we get to the Shnia, which is Rivka. That's the second wife of Shimon, the Sarah. She also likewise is excluded from Yibum and Chalitza to Levi. Why? Mishum Tzoras, because she's a Tzara of Sarah. Now the Mishnah has a limitation clause. Until now, we've been talking about a case where Shimon, before he died, married Sarah, the wife of Reuven, with a full-fledged mitzvah of Yibum in Torah, and Rivka now becomes his second wife. So Shimon, before he dies, he marries Sarah, and he has a second wife, Rivka. And she becomes the Tzara of Sarah. And Sarah, as we said before, is an erva. And the entire thrust of the Reish of the Mishnah is dealing with a case where Shimon was miyabim Sarah Eshes Reuven, which means in this case he was ba'alem. The second part of the Mishnah is going to discuss Maimar. Asaba Maimar, that's all he did, Shimon, was Mekadesh Sarah. Again, not with Bia, because that would be Yibum. We're talking about Kiddushin Greda, which would be the Kesef Hashtar. Now Mace, now Shimon dies. So again, there was never actually a Yibum between Shimon and Eshes Reuven and Sarah. There was only a Maimon. So Shnia, now referring to Rivka, that's the Tzara. Oletzes v'lovis yabemes. Is Chalitza, but no Yibum. Again, as far as Sarah is concerned, there's no need for Chalitza because Sarah, as far as Levi is concerned, is Eshes Achim. She's the wife of his brother Reuven, and there's no Yibum here because he's Lo Hayvo Lama. But now we get to a discussion about Rivka, the other wife of Shimon. Now keep in mind, Shimon and Levi were Yaakov, and there should be a Yibum in the event that Shimon dies without children, unless we apply the principle of Tzaras Erva. Now, in order to apply the principle of Tzaras Erva, we would have to assume that Rivka, when she married Shimon, was a Tzara to Sarah, who's Eshes Achim of Levi. Meaning that both Rivka and Sarah shared the same husband, in this case Shimon. Well, what do you mean they shared the same husband? if Shimon was not miyabim her, she's not an Eishes Ish. But he gave up Maimer. So let's assume that Maimer is to some extent, we'll have to figure out to what extent, is a valid marriage. Once the Maimer took place between Shimon and Eishes Reuben, we said she was called what? Sarah? At that point, Rivka becomes a Tzaras Erev, because at that point she's sharing her husband with another woman, another wife. If we recognize that Maimer as Kiddush. He says, Ein Sarah Nechsheves Legamrei Ki Ishto Shel Shimon. The Torah really doesn't recognize a marriage relationship of Kiddushin, of Kesef or Shtar, in the case of a Yavam and a Yevamah, in the case of Shimon and Sarah. Lefichach, Afal Pisha Sarah Ptura Michalitza V'Yibum. There's no question about that. There's no Yibum whatsoever. No Chalitza, no vestige of a Zikas Yibum in the case of Sarah to Levi, because that's Eishes Achi. Mikomakom, Rivka, Chayeves B'Chalitza Mi Levi. Tremendous chumrah here. We're saying that Rivka is not a full-fledged Tzaras Erev. And if she's not a full-fledged Tzaras Erev, then one thing I can guarantee you, she can't marry anyone else other than Levi without Chalitz. Levi has to give her Chalitz. However, all this is the Rabbana. On a Doraisa level, she's not a Tzaras Erev. And if she's not a Tzaras Erev, then she falls for Yibum to Levi, and there's a Zikas Yibum. She can't marry anyone without Chalitza. And Kiddushay Maimar, Shekidei Shimon es Sarah, Eino Midoraisa. That's not a rabbinic Kiddushin that's valid. How could this be valid when the Torah says he needs Bia, and now he did Kesef Ashtar? So when the Torah says there's a mitzvah of Yibum, in this case Shimon has to be Miyabim Sarah, the Torah is excluding any other method of Kiddush. There's one method and one method only, and that's Yibum. But Kesef and Shtar will not operate, will not be effective. That's on a Doraisa level. So if that be the case, then again, going back to the Doraisa level, there's no reason why Rivka should be excluded from Yibum to Levi. Rivka is not a Tzaras Erev because she never shared Shimon with Sarah, who is an Erev. She's not a Tzaras Erev because the marriage relationship between Shimon and Rivka, between Shimon and Sarah is not recognized by the Torah. So to what extent can we say that Rivka is a Tzara to Sarah, when in truth Sarah was never married, because the Torah says Yibum and not Kiddushin. Kiddushin is not valid. Why is there no Yibum to Rivka? Why is there no Yibum? She's not a Tzaras Erva. Lefisha nases Tzaras Erva midrabanan. In other words, the Rabbanan are going to recognize Maimer where the Torah completely excludes Maimer. And once you recognize that Maimer midrabanan, then Rivka becomes a Tzaras Erva. Why? Because Sarah is certainly an Erva. That's unquestionable, undeniable. She's Eishes Achi because Levi was Lohai B'Olama of Ruvain. And now we have a quasi marriage relationship, which sets up Rivka as a tsaras Arab. Now, what makes Rivka into a tsara of Sarah? The answer is that we're going to recognize the maimar between Shimon and Sarah as Kiddushin Dirabbanan. Once we recognize that marriage, now Rivka becomes a tsaras Arab, because Rivka is now married to Shimon contemporaneously, if we could use that word, contemporaneously with Sarah's marriage to Shimon. Sarah is an Arab. She's an Eishes Achtalim. And what do we mean when we say that they're both married to Shimon at the same time? I mean, Rivka was a full-fledged marriage, and Sarah was a marriage which the Torah did not recognize, because Maimar could not generate Kiddushin on a Doraisa level in the case of Yevamot. But the Rabbanan recognized that marriage. And now we could justify the final Psak Halacha, the ruling of Rivka vis-a-vis Levi after the death of Shimon. She, on the one hand, must have Chalitza because she's not a Tzaras Erev, because we don't recognize the marriage between Sarah and Shimon. So she's not a Tzaras Erev. But on the other hand, there's no possibility of Yibum because Midrabbanan, she is a Tzaras Erev. So if we have a quiz question, when do we have a case of a Tzaras Erev who's only a Tzaras Erev Dirabbanan? And in such a case, what is the din? Two parts to one question. And the answer is in Eishes Achiv Shalahaybo Lama, and there was Maimar. There it's Chalitza without Yibum. Chalitza Doraisa, but on a Drabbana level, we're going to have to exclude Yibum. So in a certain sense, Rivka now gets the worst of both worlds because she can't marry another man without Chalitza. But she can't even marry Levi, even though the Torah would require her to marry Levi on the mitzvah level of Yibum, but that mitzvah of Yibum is going to be suspended by virtue of the Rabbanon recognizing and validating Maimar as Kiddush, which makes Rivka into a Tzaras Erev. Omar Rav Nachman, man de tani rishona lo mishtabish, man de tani shnia lo mishtabish. In other words, there were two girsos in our Mishnah, and Rav Nachman wants to validate both of them. One girsa said, Harishona yotza mishum eishes achiv shlohay bolamo, vashnia mishum tzaras. We're going back to the ratio. And one girsa has Hashnia Yotza Mishum Eishes Achiv Shlohay Bolamo Varishona Mishum Tzaras. Just the opposite. In other words, in the first girsa, the word Rishona refers to the wife of Ruvain. I think we called her Sarah. And in the second girsa, the word Rishona refers to Rivka, not to Sarah, to the Tzara. So the Gemara explains Rav Nachman. Man did Tani, now we turn to Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. Rishona, right, the Girsa of Rishona, which refers to Sarah, Lo Mishtamesh, my Rishona L'Nefila. In other words, when Ruvain dies, Sarah falls for Yibum. Rivka is not going to fall for Yibum until after Shimon marries her and dies. But as far as Sarah is concerned, immediately with the death of Ruvain, she falls for Yibum. I mean, not to Levi, because Levi's not a lot, but at least to Shimon. So in that sense, we could describe Sarah as Rishona, because she's the Rishona L'Yibum, the Nefila L'Yibum. Man de Tani Shnia. Now we had another girsa in which Sarah, Ashes Reuven, is called Shnia. Lo Mishtabish, that's not a mistaken gear, so we can accept that just by that gear. So, my Shnia Linisud. So now we're talking about Shimon. It's very interesting. Shimon has two wives, but there was a sequence in his marriage to these two wives. He's married to both Rivka and Sarah. He's married to Rivka because he married Rivka, and he's married to Sarah through Yibum. And Rav Nachman is somehow magically, I don't know how, assuming that that when Shimon actually was miyavim Sarah, he was already a married man. He was already married to Rivka. So the Gemara immediately objects. Milo askinon. The Yibem v'achka konas. Who says that we're talking about a case where Shimon, at the time that he was miyavim Sarah, was already married to Rivka? Maybe he was a single guy, and he married Rivka through Yibum. I'm sorry, he married Sarah through Yibum, and then he married Rivka subsequently. So how can you tell me that Sarah is called Shnia because she was the second one to marry Shimon? Maybe she was the first one to marry Shimon. Shimon was a single guy at the time of the Yibum, and later on after Yibum, that's when he married Rivka. The Gemara answers, Elamai Shnia, not Shnia Linisuin, but rather Shnia Binisuin. In other words, in marriage, she was a Shnia. What does that mean, a Shnia? She was married twice. She was married to one brother, which is Reuven, and then after Reuven's death, she was married to Shimon through Yibum. So in Binisuin, in other words, in terms of calculating marriages, she is Shnia. Shnia means she has a double Nisuin. What's the source in the Torah from which you derive that Eishes Ach doesn't fall for Yibum? If it's Lo Hayabolama, Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Amar Kra, the pasuk says in Kitei in the parish of Yibum, Ki Yeshu Achim Yachdav. What is the significance of the word Yachdav? What drush should we derive from the word Yachdav? Shahai Salem Yeshiva Achas Ba'olam. And when the Torah says Yevama Yavolel, it's only Ki Yeshu Achim Yachdav, which means Shahaisalem Yeshiva Achas Ba'ol Prat. This is excluding the Eishes Achim Shlohaya Ba'olamo, which means to that third brother, we call him Levi, who was born after the death of Reuven, and there's no Yibum. Now he darshans the word Yachtov in a different way, as if it said Yichud, meaning designation. What is this coming to teach us? Miuchadim b'nachal, prat li'achiv mina'im. What happens if you have two brothers, we'll call them Reuven and Shimon, but they are maternal brothers. They share the same mother, but they don't share the same father. No Yibum. How do we know there's no Yibum? That we're going to derive from the word Yachdav. Yeshru Achim Yachdav. What links two brothers together? Not only the mitzvah of Yibum, but also Nachal. They divide the estate of their father. And Yachtov means two brothers that have a yichud, a common designation for the estate. And inheritance in Jewish estate law goes through the father. Mishpachosam beis avia. Prat liyochid min ha'em. So when the Torah in the Parsha of Yibum mentions Yaakov, it's telling me two things. Number one, that the two brothers were alive Yaakov, that is Yeshiva Achas, and number two, that the two brothers are both Yuchadim L'Nachal. That's the exclusion of a maternal brother. That's called Achim Min Ha'em. So who are we excluding from Yibum? In a case of Achim Min Ha'av, we're excluding Lo Haybolam. In the case of Achim Min Ha'em, we're excluding the whole relationship of these two brothers is outside of the pale of Yibum. It's very interesting because in the context of this Gemara, one could have, I'm just trying to throw out a Havamina, but I don't know if it's ridiculous, that you can have a situation where an uncle and a nephew are miyuchadim l'nachla. You have two brothers, one of which has a son. The one who has a son died, leaving a son. And then the question would be, can we divide up the nachla between the uncle and the nephew? I mean, for that, you have to know Masechet Yevamot or Perkei Shnofim. That's called mishmush nachla, where the son of the deceased will inherit his grandfather through mishmush nachla, what's called mishmush kever, even after his death. But I don't believe that there's any parallel discussion about yibum. Meaning, if you have two brothers, one of whom dies, and the living brother dies and leaves a son, who would now be the nephew of the deceased, I don't believe for one moment that there's any mitzvah yibum, even though there might be nachal. Anyway, I'm just throwing out a thought. Now we're going to offer an alternative source of halacha of yibum, of limiting yibum to two brothers from the father. Rava Omar, the fact that yibum only applies to two paternal brothers is Yolif is derived from Gzeira Shavah. Achva mibnei Yaakov. Here in the parsha of Bnei Yaakov, the pasuk says, name asar anach achim bnei avinu. Take a word. What does this mean, achva, achva? This is a different kind of Gzeira Shavah, I think. I mean, in our parsha it says, ki yeshru achim. I see. Achva, achva is the same as achim, achim. The word achim appears in two parshas. In the parsha of Yimum, ki yeshru achim Yaakov, and the parsha of the brothers of the children of Yaakov, where it says, Shnei Masar Anachnu Achim B'nei Avim. Again, the word Achim. Yeshua Achim, Achim, Achim. Malahal, just like by the B'nei Yaakov, is Achim Min Ha'av V'lo Min Ha'em. They all share the same father. And they were divided up into four mothers. That's called Mena'av V'lo Min Ha'em, yet they're called Ach. Afkan Mena'av V'lo Min Ha'em. So to in Yibum, it's Ach Mena'av V'lo Ach Min Ha'em. See, you read this Gemara, you get the impression that the word achim always means achim in a. I'm not sure that that's true. I'd love to do a word search through Tanakh and see if achim is a word that even applies to achim in a. Okay, in the case of Shiftei Ka, they were all achim in a. They didn't all have the same mother. But if you have two brothers that have the same mother, can we not call them achim in biblical Hebrew? And once you find the word ach or achim with regard to achim and a'im, that undermines this whole Gzeira Shavah. And I think that the Gemara's objection that's going to raise now is very similar on the same lines as what we said. In Nelif, achva achva me'arayos. Let's look at the Parsha of Arayos, and there too we have the word ach. So in Vayikra Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Tes Zayin, ervas eshes achicha lo sigaleh. But what is this referring to? Eshes ach. We have an erva here of Eshes ach. Now, what happens in the case of maternal brothers? Two brothers that share the same mother. And one, after the death of the other, marry the wife of his maternal brother. He says, "B'kasuv zeh nichlalos bein eshes ach me'av, bein eshes ach me'a'em." Guess what? The erva of eshes ach applies to your maternal brother. We share the same mother. I cannot marry your wife, even after you die, even after you divorce. So if that be the case, we see that the word achim refers to a maternal brother. So now we're stuck, because in the case of Yibam, are we going to compare it to this achim, like the sons of Yaakov, or to this achim, like Eshes ach in the erva of a maternal Eshes ach, maternal brother? The Gemara says, "Donim achim me achim." He ain't donim achim me achicha. In the Parsha of Arayos, it says, "Ervas eshes achicha." So it doesn't have the word achim. In the Parsha of Bereishis, it says Shnei Masar Anachnu Achim, and Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachad. So in Gzeira Shavah, if we have two choices, we'll pick the one which is more exact, which is a duplicate. The Ein Donim Achim Yachichu. And now the Gemara is going to embark upon a whole study of the rules that govern Gzeira Shavah. Like if you would open up open up the Encyclopedia Talmudit, there's an erech there called Gzeira Shavah, and it's going to be based on this Gemara that we're learning here. And the Gemara says, "My nafkamina, who cares if there's a slight difference in the word? Hatana debei Rav Yishmael, we can use a shoresh if the word is the same in its basic root, even though it's conjugated a little bit differently. Achim, achicha." it's valid for Gzeira Shava. Now, Rabbi Shmuel is making a comment with regard to Negoim, specifically Nigei Batim. And there's a whole series of what's called Hezger, that if you see a nega and a bias, some sort of a growth in the wall of the house, then you have to lock it up. And that's called Hezger. So there's 1 week and then another week. So after the first week, the Torah says, V'shav HaKohen. The Kohen comes back to check and determine whether Pasa Nega or Lo Pasa Nega. If the Kohen determines that Lo Pasa Nega, then we lock up the house for a second week. And then the pasuk says, Uba HaKohen. And the Kohen comes now after the second week to examine the bias and the nega. And since the Torah says V'shav HaKohen and Uba HaKohen, that itself gives me a Gzeira Shava. Zoe Shiva, Zoe Bia. Coming and going. And this Gzeira Shava Rabbi Shmuel, from which he derives various halachas. I don't have a list here. Maybe you have it in your Gemara, a list of halachas that are, or maybe he does have it. Numbers Zion here. Kishem she'im pasha nega liachar shavua richon eino note tzabayis elacholis zvodim akatses v'poseh v'tochas abayis u'mazgiro shuv hu adin b'nega shalo pasuk b'sof shavua rishon el b'sof shavua shem. So there are dinim of chalitza sa'even, maktzia, v'tochas abayis, u'mazgiro. I mean, all these details are derived from this Gzeira Shava, equating the Kohen at the end of the first week of Hezger with the Kohen at the end of the second week. But you see clearly that V'shav and Uba, which, this is even a more far-reaching conclusion about Gzeira Shava. V'shav and Uba don't even have the same shorach. They're identified in the meaning of the word. The Kohen goes back to check the house. That's called V'shav. And Uba means the Kohen goes back to check the house. The first time after week number 1, second after week number 2. And Rabbi Shmuel generates a Gzeira Shava. He learns all the dinim of the second Re'iyah of the Kohen after the Hezger Sheni of the second week to the deriving it from the dinim of the first week. And Uba Kohen from V'shav Kohen. So he Shiva, Zoe Bia. Since they have the same mashma'ut, the same meaning, the same translation, basically, we can derive a Gzeira Shava. And therefore, Achim and Achicha in the case of Erva and Achim in the case of Yibum, even though they're not exactly the same words, but nevertheless, it's the inyanim, the concept and the context and the meaning is Shabbat. Where it says Hani Mili, when do we have this more broad, loose, liberal license for Gzeira Shava, even though the words are not exactly the same? That's Heicha Deleka Midi Didamile. There's no other candidate. In other words, we talk about V'shav Kohen and Uba Kohen in the context of Re'iyas Negoyim. There is no other context or a possible candidate for another context. When we have two options of either comparing Achim to Achim of Yerusha or Achim, again, at each time the word Achim is Yibum, to Achicha and Erva, then Midadami lo Yalfinon, we choose and we prefer the exact word for Gzeira Shava. Achim from Yibum to Nachla, rather than Achim to Achicha in Erev. The Gemara asks, V'leilif achva milot. I'm going to show you the word Achim, so that you can't tell me it's not Damila. The identical word Achim of Yibum appears in the context of Lot. V'chsiv vayomer Avram el Lot, alma sehi mariva beini u'beinecha u'bein ro'ai u'bein ro'echa ki anoshim achim anach. Now keep in mind that Avram is the uncle of Lot. Right? We're going to read this pasuk this Shabbos. So if we're going to equate Achim of Yibum with Achim of Avram and Lot, then we're going to come to the conclusion, which is untenable, that in Yibum, this is what I was discussing before, the uncle and the nephew will have a Yibum setup, which means the nephew could be Miyameh, the wife of his uncle, because that's also called Achim Anachnu. An uncle and a nephew are called Achim. And Lot is the son of Haran, if I remember correctly. Did I get that right? And Haran was the brother of Avram. And if Haran and Avram are called Achim, it means that an uncle and his nephew, his brother's son, are considered Achim. And in that sense, let's say if Eishes Avram would fall for Yibum to Haran, and Haran is gone, and Haran left his son Lot, Lot should be Miyabim Eishes Avram, the wife of his uncle. And the Gemara rejects this by saying, Mistabra b'nei Yaakov, Havalei Melech. It makes sense that if we want to learn Gzeira Shava of Achim, in Yibum, we should derive from b'nei Yaakov, b'nei Mishum de Mafne, min Havalei Lichtav Shnei Masar Vadecha b'nei Avicha, Uksiv Achim, Shma Mina, Lafnuye. Oh, I see. It's getting late. So let's leave Lafnuye for tomorrow. Li Neder. What is tomorrow? Thursday?
Yeah.
How did that happen? You'd ask that question about all of them. Okay, so we skipped a little bit of Agadata. I hope you won't fault me for that. And tomorrow we'll finish up this sugya about drushes, and we'll get back to the halachic rules that govern Yibum. So have a great day.